Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations. This is the theme for 2025 Africa Day celebration, a day set out to celebrate Africa's history and its rich heritage. Joining us today, we're going to be speaking to Stephen Bernardus Haraṭgaeb, who will be speaking on the issue of reparations and why this topic is particularly important. He represents the African Union's Transitional Justice Group, who focuses on these issues, if I might say so myself. Good day, Stephen. How are you doing?
Thank you, Donald, for having me.
Great. All right, Stephen, let's quickly just have an understanding of the scope of job that you have working with the African Union and what it means to work under the division of transitional justice.
Sure. So transitional justice is work that we have really been doing for over a couple of decades. It was influenced by civil society actors, political actors, academia, who really looked at Africa and said there was violence that was perpetrated against African people. And therefore, we have to think about how do we move from conflict to a post-conflict society? And to bridge that gap, what do we need to do? What needs to be in place? What tools do we need to think about? What environment do we need to create to help bring redress, bring justice, to bring peace, so that we don't repeat those conflicts in the past that has taken place on Africa? And that's how the transitional justice work started to happen, where people started advocating for it. And then it translated into similar work that the African Union was doing around silencing the guns, etc. In 2019, member states passed the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which basically provided a framework for the continent to think about how do we deal with historical injustices, whether it is a result of coup d'etats, is a result of colonialism, is a result of atrocities that were committed against African people. How do we think about redress in that sense? And that policy, after the last 5 years, was being implemented by different countries. What we then started to realize is that we need to have a body in place through the reference group, the Transitional Justice Reference Group, to support governments to be able to contextualize that policy and make it make sense for them in the specific context of that country. So the policy is a wide document. What the countries or specific governments do is take that policy and say, how do we try to make sure that it reflects our lived experience, reflects our context, reflects our lived realities in terms of what's going on here, and what tools are the best in response to the atrocities that has been suffered. So you'll see some countries, for example, have truth and reconciliation commissions. Others would have community-based truth-telling commissions. Others would, for example, have judicial responses such as going to court, etc., for crimes against humanity. So there are different forms that are created by the policy. What it allows, though, it says this is a framework that we're then using that drives for us to bring peace and justice for African people.
All right, Stephen, understanding the topic and conversation around reparations is very important. Looking at it from African perspective, Africa is one continent that wholeheartedly, most of the countries actually, have a topic around reparations because of the history that we all share as Africans, that also born concepts of Pan-Africanism and why this is important to unite as Africa. Absolutely. Okay? But the discussion around reparations is one that doesn't just come up in Namibia. It comes up in South Africa, it comes up in Angola, it comes up in East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, wherever. Let's have a contextual understanding of what this reparations mean and what does it mean for Namibia specifically?
Sure. So from a global perspective, really we have to understand that the violence that was perpetrated against African people not only stayed in Africa, right? So through slavery, for example, through colonialism, we saw lots of African bodies being taken and punished and tortured and used as slave labor, whether it was in the Caribbean, whether it was in Latin America, whether it's in the Greater America, in the Northern America, etc., in Europe, etc. So we have to think about reparations and justice, not just from an African perspective in terms of people that live in Africa, but those who are taken out of this continent. Then the second thing that we need to think about is that colonialism was an organizational project. It was not a one-man show. It was not a one-country show. It was countries coming together and perpetuating violence against black folk. And therefore, accountability cannot just be limited to one country or two countries or three countries. We have to have a collective responsibility and collective accountability, therefore. And that's why I think it's powerful that not only Africans and people on the continent, but those in the diaspora and those of African descent are coming together and raising this alarm and raising to say this collective harm that was done to our people, collective justice, therefore also needs to happen as well. And therefore, what also makes it an amazing opportunity for Namibia is that then we are not just speaking about reparations as a silo in a wilderness making noise by ourselves. We are then joining a collective group of other folk together, saying that we want to see justice happen for all of us, and therefore amplifying each other's stories, amplifying each other's experiences, amplifying each other's ways that we're thinking about redress, etc. Learning, sharing key learnings across each other. And therefore, no longer is it an isolated country or indigenous group's imperative or prerogative. Now what we're seeing is that collective support and collaboration, both on the continent and also across the world as well, saying that we have to think about this as a collective responsibility for those who have colonized and harmed our folks.
All right. Looking at Namibia, we'll touch on the global aspect just a little bit later, but looking at Namibia, Namibia has had an instance where genocide was not recognized, not just by the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators, but also by people within Namibia, institutions within Namibia. The highest institution which can recognize a day of such is the government. But looking at it, genocide is a widely debated topic, and reparations is an extension of this widely debated topic. Can we touch on the aspect of Namibian genocide and reparations that come to follow that genocide and what it means for Namibian people, also within modern day? What are the repercussions of genocide that had happened close to 100 years ago to this modern day Namibia?
I think it's critical for us to think about genocide, both not as just the harm that is perpetrated to the group of people that had happened 120 years ago. We have to think about how is that legacy, that historical legacy, showing up today. Second thing that we need to think about is that genocide is clear. Although Namibia had thought about genocide and struggled to bring that terms to it, I think we're thinking about apartheid, and there are other issues that people are thinking about to not to deal with the issues of genocide. Then the issue that we think about is who gets to tell the story? Who gets to say the Namibian story, the Namibian suffering? Because it's easy for us to then try and contextualize our suffering to say this pocket of suffering, that pocket of suffering, that pocket of suffering, and not realize that it is actually a collective suffering, that as Namibians we suffered. So when genocide is perpetuated against the Nama Herero people, the San and the Damara as well, it is Namibians who suffered that harm, and not necessarily that tribes, it's Namibians. And I think we have to think about it in both senses. It's directly to a tribe, but at the same time, it's Namibians as well. And I think for a long time, from a political level, people struggle to name what it was, which is genocide. And therefore, we could not have justice and reparations without understanding that there was needed to be truth being told about what actually took place and the harm that people experienced. When you think about the genocide of the Nama Herero people, and including the San and the Damara, you think about them being exterminated, an exterminating order being put in place, their land being dispossessed, their culture being disrupted, them being, their English and their language being changed, them being enslaved, and then you think about them being driven out of their ancestral land and the harm that is caused to those folk. When you think about some being in concentration camps, a lot of what is happening in Nazi Germany against the Jews really was pre-tested in Namibia, right? So we cannot then separate the harm and the collective harm that was caused on our folk, and the Namibian folk, particularly when it was a genocide order that was put in place, and then say that we're just moving on. Because moving on, what does it actually mean for those who are harmed? When you think about, we're not going to hold anybody accountable because it happened in the past, but we see the repercussions thereof now. When you think about the dispossession of land, right now we know that almost 70 or 80% of Namibians don't have ownership to land. That is a direct link you can see to that. When you think about gender-based violence, is a direct link to atrocities, double atrocities that we face as a country, with genocide and apartheid in this country, where violence was the norm of our day. That is our language. It's in our social fabric. So we cannot separate when violence that we see against children, gender-based violence, to not the historical violence that our people suffered. When you think about migrant labor and the system that continued to break our families. So it's imperative when we talk about reparations, not to only think about money as a reparatory tool. It is definitely an important and empirical one, but we have to think about the cultural genocide that people suffered. We have to think about the dispossession of land that people have suffered. We have to think about the families that have been broken. We have to think about ancestral land that has been taken from people and the harm that has been caused on them. So when you think about redress, it cannot be us just throwing money at something. It has to be able to say, we have to acknowledge the harm that has been done and not just say, well, there were some acts that were happened that people kind of got harmed along the way. It is a genocide that has taken place, and therefore the redress has to be accompanied to the same thing as well, and not only to those people that were impacted, by the descendants thereof. Even something issues as, for example, bringing remains home of those who have been exterminated. There are many who grieve, family members grieve, and those who they have lost, but have no bodies, have nothing physical to grieve. That ambiguous loss continues to perpetuate right now. And when you think about economic development of our people, when you think about the San folk, when you think about specific groups of folks in this country who are disproportionately excluded in this national conversation, we cannot then divorce that from the harm that continues to be perpetuated against them, because that harm is being pulled through, and therefore it's imperative for redress to not just happen from a developmental level, but redress to think about those who caused the harm, to recognize it and bring justice. And what does justice mean? It's being just. It's not about what the perpetrator determines what is just. It's the descendants, it is the people, it is the survivors, it is the victims who experience the harm that determine and articulate and say, this is what justice actually looks like for us.
When we speak about genocide, we only speak about loss. The two things that you have stated, which actually really stood out for me, is the cultural genocide that happened. And with that, there's also identity assassination that happened within. How do you think, in terms of when we look at the landscape of Namibia, affected parts of Namibia, there are certain affected parts of Namibia that you can see in terms of only names, you know, in terms of street names and what the momentum is. What would you say about this identity assassination that people had faced within Namibia? When you look at the names of Namibian towns, for instance, we've got ones that are Windhoek, the Walfish Base, we've got the Luderitz. The story of Luderitz is one that we need to also have as a discussion as Namibian people. But the identity assassinations, in terms of where do we start when we try to give back this identity to the people, the loss of land by the Khomanin people, who for the longest time in an independent Namibia did not have did not have ancestral land, and had to go back and forth with a municipality council on these issues. Okay, when we look at the name in itself that has been assassinated, that has true meaning to Namibian people, we're talking about names such as Transitional, which refers to the Transitional River, which today is adopted as Swakopmund. Names that is Kusakros, you know, Kariseb, you know, Aikams here. We can also go down south to the Namakwa land and say these important names that we have today, the Karibams, which is Oranjemund, okay, Ngamingus, original names of Luderitz. But today we have adopted those names that was foisted on by the colonizers at the time, and we have to live in it in an independent Namibia. What's the say on that?
I think it's absolutely correct, and we need to challenge that, right? And part of that cultural genocide that we often don't speak about is that it happens so ambiguously without us actually feeling it, right? So it's intangible, but in the way people show up, in the way we use language, in the way we engage, right? And even the names that we use, the architecture, how we live, right? For example, we say for the San folk who are nomads, that we expect them now to almost become farmers and build a home and then have a little piece of land to do that. It is almost endemic, I guess, on us, because what we then end up doing is adopting the very same system that was used to oppress us to then call it development. And I think we have to think of and reimagine what governance actually looks like. And governance for me looks like courage. It's a courage to have those difficult conversations around what do we name our places. It's a courage to be able to say, these are the words that we need to use. Some of the pushback, for example, that we often hear is somebody will say, I can't pronounce that name, and therefore I'm going to keep to the Ludret's name. That is absolutely, we should not, that is definitely something we should not even tolerate. Because what we do is we start to learn and teach people that our Black Afrocentric names are difficult, and therefore because you've mentally said that that's what it is, then you don't even make the effort to learn it. And I guess in a multicultural country like Namibia, which is very, which is not homogenous like European countries, we even have deeper work to do, because we have to realize the architecture of apartheid and colonialism was division. To say, you go here, you tribe go there, you who speak like this stay here, and created those divisions to make sure that we're not united. We have to do the work to unite. We have to do the work to overcome those tribal lines that have been created. And even in that space where, for example, people that are of different tribal ethnic groups, for example, would say that I don't speak that language and therefore I cannot use that name. We have to do that work. But it's a difficult conversation that is needed to be had, because our development of our country cannot happen if there are folks and people in this country that still feel left out. And that's exactly what apartheid, exactly what genocide, exactly what colonialism showed us, is that culture of exclusion. And if there's people that are excluded who are not participating in the national democratic processes of this country and are not feeling that they're part of this Namibian house that former president spoke about, late president spoke about, then we have to say, what do we need to do in terms of redress, in terms of reparations to Namibian folk, to be able to say, we are giving you the best opportunity to start to become the best that you can be. When you think the pursuit of happiness, it's about saying, what are we actually putting in place? When there's poverty, pockets of poverty in this country, pockets of, and not just deep pockets of poverty, but at the same time, we've got millionaires in this country. And it's the same contrast across the continent as well. We've got multi-billion-dollar startups happening in this continent, and at the same time, there's deep levels of poverty in this continent as well. There are countries that are, for example, thriving. There's lots of peace, and there's conflict and digressing and reversal of democratic processes. We are living in contrast all the time. And it's imperative as African people for us to do the work to say, how do we move us forward? When you talk about the Agenda 2063 as part of Africa Day, it is an ambitious agenda, but it has to translate to a girl that is in Sudan, for example, at the moment, trying to flee her country, trying to flee from harm. When you think about a child in Namibia, in the south as well, who's living in the informal settlement, who's living in the rural areas, who's with his teenage pregnancies that continue to harm them, and that continues to interrupt their social mobility, where young people, when you think about youth unemployment, is significantly high for this country. What does that actually mean when we talk about Agenda 2063 and the vision that we're pushing for, when significant portions of our country, for significant portions of our populations, continue to feel excluded in this national discourse? And are we just maintaining institutions and processes that were used by the colonizers, that were used by those who harmed us, to continue to perpetuate, because what it provides is some form of elitism? And I think it's imperative for us to interrogate those things as well, because how do we want to live in a continent that we are not seeing where we're not seeing the truest value of people thriving, having abundance, etc. And again, we cannot run away from the issues of, for example, foreign interest, right? Extractive policies, extractive partnerships, where people on the ground, on the continent, are not benefiting from the natural resources, and they're just being extracted. Our poverty levels are shocking, right? Malnourishment is shocking. The violence against children is shocking. The educational attainment is shocking. So we are talking about Africa rising, But when you talk about Africa rising, but young people are feeling excluded and the system is not providing opportunity for them and they are not reaching their ideal, how do we talk about Africa rising? Then it's a contradiction because who is it rising for? Is it just for the elites? And we have to be able to interrogate that. We have to hold each other accountable as well. When we talk about African leaders, we have to be able to say what is actually going on directly, especially for women and children. And that is the evidence I was used to say, are they actually bettering? Are they actually attaining the goals that they're supposed to do? And if they're not reaching their milestones, what are we actually doing in our governance systems if it's not translating into betterment for those guys? And if it's not, it's an indictment upon us. So we cannot just talk about Africa and celebrating the milestones that we're making when at the same time significant portions of this population is in distress as we speak. And we talk about the youth bulge and about Africa's future. I think we're putting an unnecessary burden on young people to fix it. A system that is constantly excluding them, not hearing their voice, and not providing for them and actually harming them. We're not providing power to young people. We could say just a couple of young people appointment, fantastic, great. But true power of young people is giving them voice, giving them narrative, giving them budgets to say, here is resources, go and continue to expand this continent. So we have to unpack those issues as well, because it's no longer just platitudes of saying Africa is this and Africa is that, and we're transforming and we're going to have the youngest population. That's a risk factor for me, because I don't think we're making the necessary investments to make sure that those young people become the citizens they're supposed to be for this continent, even not making that investment right now.
Right. Looking at colonialism, looking at a time before Africa realized that, no, it exists on a global platform, but it doesn't exist for itself, all right? We see that the harms that colonialism has caused has not only harmed Namibia, Africa, or so on, all right? Namibians in Namibia or Africans in Africa. It had gone as further as USA, Germany, and so on. In the modern day world, in countries that regard themselves as the liberal democracies of the world, we still see the effects and aftermaths of colonialism. We still see how black people in the diaspora are treated wherever they are, whether it's in the east, west, south, but specifically speaking of the global north. Certain stories are being told around the world. And it's not just stories and how they're treated by individuals. It's also systems that are in place, all right? Let's talk about that.
I think we have to also, again, interrogate the kind of systems that we're part of, right? And what that actually means. When people talk about Africa and the interest in Africa, I don't think people say they're excited about Africa because they have some special feelings about Africa and saying, oh, this is great. I think there is a very driven capitalist worldview that wants to destroy Africa and take all of its resources for themselves, right? For own greed and self-gain. So the question often is about, for who, right? Who's the beneficiary thereof? And when we talk about people in the diaspora or people of African descent, whether it's in the global south particularly, and the impacts thereof, because all of us experience some level of colonialism, particularly in the global south. We cannot divorce that from the legacy of where we had come from, right? The legacy of harm that people have experienced, the legacy of injustice people have experienced, and the systems that continue to drive it, because it's an incentive, right? As long as we incentivize this behavior, things are not going to change. And it's imperative then upon us to then say, what are we doing to be able to protect ourselves and protect our interests and protect our people? Both on the continent, but also those in the diaspora and those of African descent as well. That South-to-South cooperation is something that people are speaking about a lot more, which is fantastic. But then what I'm again asking is, but for who? How does it translate to those people that are not in the conference room? Because I think about my life, Donald, in the fact that I have opportunity to be in policy spaces. I have opportunity to be in the highest office. I have opportunity to be in multilateral spaces. And at the same time, I see and I speak to young people. I sit on a pavement with a 10-year-old. I walk around in our streets and I see where young people are at. And that's where the bleeding is happening. because what I'm experiencing in one end versus what I'm also experiencing on the local level is not meeting. Something is amiss. And when you even think about it on a global scale, same thing again. The levels of inequality are significantly high. But that inequality is not just African, particularly, it's across the globe as well, right? And that's because economically, we were not put in a position where we were actually able to be economically viable, right? And harm was done in that result as well, because it serves somebody's interest to keep us the way that we are. And therefore, redressing and challenging some of those means we have to be able to then say, how do we reimagine some of these institutions, some of these multilateral organizations? How do we position ourselves in a way that actually says that we are fighting for our own interests and and us cooperating together? Because again, as I spoke about, the architecture of division that came as a result of colonialism that put these artificial borders on the continent, for example, is again something that we need to overcome to say then our interests are aligned. How do we then work together to actually achieve the goals that we want to do? But that means we have to be able to interrogate that line between the great policy levels, multilateral organizations, opportunities and access that we have, and policies that we have passed that are amazing and incredible, even on the continent, but the lived realities of those who are vulnerable and who continue to be more vulnerable now than they were. If we're saying that the country and the globe is improving, we're talking about AI and technology and where we are as a continent right now, but a young person doesn't even have electricity. They still have to walk a couple of kilometers to school, or the school has been bombed. They don't even have access to education. We have to be able to interrogate those conversations a lot more. And we have to hold ourselves accountable as well, I think, as African leaders. And say, like, how do we then start to work together to say, we need to push back and say that we need to collaborate. When you think about the African Free Trade Agreement, for example, how do we make that much more of a reality? When entrepreneurs are finding it difficult, for example, to start up businesses on the continent, when flying across this continent or even driving across the continent is expensive. How do we talk about unity when the systems that we actually built and are continue to, or not even built, that we inherited actually, and we have not changed and transformed and amended to actually be reflective of our experience, are continuing to limit our mobility?
All right, Stephen, it's very easy to just blame the problems that we experience on the continent, within the continent of Africa, on colonialism as well, which played a very vital role in terms of where the continent is right now. But more importantly, also looking at it from a different perspective. How does cross communication and cross problems, I'm looking for a better way to put it, sure. Yeah, but when we have to look at the likes of African countries that are fighting each other, that are next to each other, that are fighting each other, that continuously continue with this war with each other. We all know the famous ones, the Hamas war that's happening currently. Also in the Tigray region, those are wars that are still continuously affecting African people, specifically young people, from living a normal life and self-actualizing. Anybody and everybody within the continent, a country or whatsoever, need to self-actualize. How do atrocities that happen that are caused by our own leaders affect African people? There are different ways that we can look at it. We can look at it from a perspective of war. We can look at it from a perspective of just basic freedoms that an individual can have, such as speaking out about something that's bothering you, okay? Being an activist for this little thing that might be important, that might arise right now, which is probably education within that country, may seem very small to Namibian or Namibia and us, but for this person, it's something that they actually need to have. Let's talk about it from that perspective of how things are affecting Africans.
No, completely correct. And I think it's important for us to take accountability as Africans for our own problems. And some of it that we have continued to, whether it's a result of a legacy of colonialism or that we've all perpetrated in our own selves. And I think we cannot divorce our human experience, right? And what I mean by that is a lot of our leaders that have taken over power may have come in good stead or goodwill to say that we're fighting the oppressors and then become part of the oppressed. the oppressive regime themselves as well. And we have to call that out. Those of us who are in independent places must call those out. We must hold the feet to the fire, right? When you're in multilateral organizations, we have to be able to speak truth to power for those who are not able to speak, where there is no dissent. We must be able to raise dissent. We cannot just gloss over some of these things as well, right? And I think that's why it's important, because every country has its own sovereignty, and therefore we cannot impede on that. But definitely we can call out the ideals and the values that we've articulated in Agenda 2063 in terms of what we want, whether it is silencing the guns, whether it's peaceful and democratic processes, whether it's healthy, prosperous young people, whether it is vibrant communities and businesses, whatever that might be. It is articulated in our Agenda 2063. Those are the values we're espousing for. We need to hold each other accountable to that, and say, Donald, are you actually living up to these values? And that's what we need to have as peers as well. Or if I'm seeing a country that's not doing it, to be able to say, this is the values that we've agreed as Africans that we're pursuing. This is not in alignment with those values. And that's why it's important for us to hold each other accountable. We cannot always externalize the problems. We have to also recognize who is responsible here as well. And I think that's why it's critical, even in the transitional justice policy that we spoke about, that also makes provisions for that. Because often when you think about transitional justice, the victims and survivors, perpetrators sometimes are not so clear, right? When you got child soldiers, for example, that are perpetrating atrocities, they are themselves victims in this war, right? So how do you then have a conversation around that is actually responsive to that lived reality of that young person there as well, that actually redresses that, for example, because they, for example, found themselves in a vulnerability position that caused them to be sucked up into this space. And in the same way, we have to have those conversations as Africans as well, as African leaders, and not just kind of gloss away around these things as well, in the name of saying it is sovereign and we're not there, because we have to fight for African people, regardless of who is in power, because we have agreed fundamentally these are the values we're pursuing, and hold people accountable to the same as well.
All right, looking at, and I think this is the final question, but looking at it from the perspective of a global leadership point of view, when you're looking at it, Africa faces two things, I might say, if I have to narrow it down to two things. One, it's how leaders in Africa are included in global leadership positions. To date, Africa is said to be an independent continent. However, in terms of making decisions and who makes true decisions in the one globally recognized organization, which is the United Nations, Africa does not have any veto power. And there are certain debates around it that justifies to the Security Council now as to why Africa should not be included in a Security Council decision. One thing that matters so much is representative. And we know this to be true when we are looking at it from the perspective of decision making. You said it earlier. If we have to look at it from a point of decision making, you have to look at it from a point of who's represented there and who can make that decision. Okay? Who is able to make that decision for me? In as much as is my namesake, I don't think Donald Trump will be able to make a decision that is in my best interest, okay? As a person from Namibia. So we need to understand what that representation would mean for Africa in order to have a certain level of power which allows Africa to make decisions for Africans that can benefit. America can easily say that, no, this won't benefit Americans, or the global north, for instance, and say that, no, we veto it. Even 100%. If the rest of the United Nations delegates voted to pass this as a resolution. So that representation is what's lacking for Africa. Can we talk about that? Sure.
And I think that's a conversation that that they have had. And I think the African Union is, I think, now a non-permanent member, if I'm not mistaken. Or was proposed to be a permanent member. Just confirm that for me before I hurried out. So what's critical for us, I think, to think about, especially for multilateral organizations, one is we are getting into a system that was never designed for us, right? And we have to then think about how do we understand and leverage that system to our benefit. Two, most Africans or African leaders, when we think about access to these multilateral organizations, for me, the biggest challenge is actually what I'm seeing is that there's actually a realignment that's actually taking place right now as a result of this recent elections, where I think people are reimagining global order and global power. I think we're going to a multi-sectoral, or what's the word I'm looking for? Different centers of power are starting to emerge as we speak about it. And I think multilateral institutions are under threat. Institutions as a whole are under threat. People are questioning and asking, rightfully as you are doing, what the purpose of institutions are. Are they actually serving where we are? The issues around expertise are under question, right? People are questioning the WHO, organizations such as like that, and saying, are they actually existing for the benefit of all? Is it existing for their own selves or unto themselves? So I think there is a shift that is taking place in the Overton window in terms of what we think about global organization and global leadership. And I think Africa needs to position herself as one saying that this is how we're imagining what that actually looks like for us. And that means us taking hold of our own leadership and our own power and strengthening our own multilateral organization, which is the African Union, right? Member states investing in that institution, actually strengthening that, because then that brings us greater power, because we're representing almost 1.2 billion, 1.5 billion people as an organization. And I think because we have failed or are challenged in our own multilateral organization within that we have in our regional bodies right now through SADC, ECOWAS, etc., we're not fulfilling the ideals of that organization supposed to be doing at its full potential. How do you then expect us to then engage in a different organization with the same level of strength and clarity of mind if we're not doing the same for us here? So I think that's important for us. So we have to strengthen our own institutions. We have to strengthen our own policies and our own frameworks here. Then we can speak with the clarity of one voice to say, because we agree fundamentally this is the direction we're going, this is then how we can be able to articulate and speak for ourselves here. But again, when you talk about the issues of division, the architecture of division that continues to impact us, people then think about not the collective of the continent's well-being, but what is in the interest of my specific country, etc. And as long as those opportunities are coming in and we provide those, then it undermines the collective goals, right? And I think that's what we need to think about. I think although we need to engage the multilaterals and push for African representation, I think the world is shifting as we're in front of our eyes. It's reordering itself. Africa needs to be in a place, especially in our own systems of we've said we're building for Africans to solve our own African problems. We need to fix that and strengthen our own institutions before we can even engage in that level.
All right, Stephen, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and also in celebrating Africa Day. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners and viewers to know in terms of Africa Day as a whole, or just your role as a transitional justice, AU transitional justice on the continental reference group?
So I'll probably end on a good note because I feel like I've been bashing the continent. But it's important for us to have clarity in terms of what we're celebrating. And I think and that's why I spoke about the contradictions as a continent. We have billions of dollars of startups across the continent. One of the fastest growing economies is on the continent right now. But again, we have levels of poverty that people are continuing to experience as well. And I think it's important for us to celebrate the vibrancy of African young people, and particularly having startups, starting global businesses, innovating, responding to community needs. I want to give a shout out specifically to activists, community leaders that continue to be on the ground, who are often unnamed, who are not often in the room, but continue to see a problem, see an issue around their community and respond. Whether it's just saying, I know like a lady down the road here in Katutura, for example, I met her for the first time through somebody else who just makes soup for some children who are orphans in Katutura. Nobody knows her. She never advertises her thing. She just does it because she's like, oh, these kids are hungry. I'm going to make extra food, feed them. And I think that's the power of Africa. And I think that's the power of our people, right? That we don't often wait for titles. We don't wait for somebody to give us permission. We take leadership. We take a seat at the table. When we see something is broken, we try to fix it. And I think that's the power that I really want to leave with us, to say that we are at the cusp of transforming what actually looks like in a global world. When we start to elevate those who are innovating, those who are entrepreneurial, those who are challenging the system and saying, we want to uplift not only ourselves, but our communities. And there are many, many who are doing significant work on the continent in their communities who are unsung heroes. And they're the ones we need to celebrate when you talk about Africa Day.
All right. All right. We just want to thank you very much for one more time for coming through to this interview and providing insights to Touch FM and its NBC One's viewers.
Fantastic.
All right. This year's Africa Day will be celebrated under the theme Justice for Africans and People of African Descent. This is a theme that resonates with trying to unite the African that we know as a continent, with each and everybody being united, but also addressing issues that came with colonialism. With that said, thank you very much for tuning in.